Hello, this is Dr. Alan Yim. Tonight I'm going to show you how to invert chords and how to recognize what inversion a chord is in. So first of all, what is a chord inversion? Well, we know now that normally, maybe I shouldn't even say normally, but to create a chord, we are going to be stacking thirds on top of each other, either to create a triad or a seventh chord. And this is just the way that we can think about these as stacked thirds. Now, when you invert a chord, usually this is the way that it's shown. You take the bottom note and you just put it up on the top like this. So we might do something like this and put this note up here. If we want to invert this chord one more time, we could do the same thing again, put the A on top like this. Now you'll notice for a triad we can only invert twice. We can invert it the first time and the second time. This position we are going to call root position. So root position, first inversion, and second inversion. But if we try to invert it again, there's no such thing as a third inversion of a triad, because this again is just root position, right? So this is the same thing as a root position chord. We're not even going to pay attention to this. It's just root, first, and second inversion. For a seventh chord, I'm going to do this same process. And what you should notice as I'm doing this is what these chords look like. Okay, so let's take a seventh chord. This is a root position seventh chord. And now here's where it gets a little bit tricky, because unlike the triad, I have to move the G to the top. And so either the G or the F are going to have to stick out because it's a second, and we can't stack those notes on top of each other. Now you will see this written in different ways. Sometimes it's out to the left, sometimes it's out to the right. Sometimes one note's sticking out and the other one is not. In other words, I can make the F stick out or I can make the G stick out. But for now, I'm just making the root of the chord be the one that sticks out. Oh my gosh, I'm going to go into a bunch of ledger lines. Wow. All right, so this is root position seventh chord. This is first inversion seventh chord. This is a second inversion seventh chord, and this is the third inversion. Sorry, it's a little bit sloppy with those ledger lines. If I wanted to rewrite this one, maybe on the staff a little bit clearer, it would look something like this. Like that. Okay, so that's a little bit better. You get the idea. Okay, so here are the inversions and what they sound like in the positions that I just wrote them. Here are the triads. And here are the seventh chords. This happens to be a dominant. Did I make a mistake there? Wow. Sorry, guys. Let's try that again. See what I mean by ledger lines? This should actually be like this. Okay, I thought that looked a little odd. And then if I take this one down an octave. Okay. Now, we do have some shorthand for these things. I'll get into the chord symbols in a later video, but I do want to show you some shorthand that we use, because it's a little bit much when we start doing analysis to write root, first, second, third. No, that's a little bit much. So we have a shorthand. Later, actually in the next video, I'll explain exactly where this shorthand comes from. It's called the figured bass, and it does come from the Baroque period. It was a form of chord symbols. So let me show you what they look like. So for the triads, I'm going to start with the root position, then first inversion, and then second inversion. And of course I'm going to put third down here, but that's only going to apply for the 7th chords. Okay, you can make this little chart yourself. And okay, so for triads, there's nothing. Triads are the most common, so we don't actually have a symbol for this in the figured bass. For first inversion, we use a 6. For second inversion, we use a 6/4. And of course, like I mentioned before, there's no third inversion. That's just going back to root position. For 7th chords, okay, a root position 7th chord is a 7. First inversion is 6/5. Second inversion is 4/3. And third inversion is 4/2. Now, if I gave this to you as a puzzle, you might try figuring this out. Where did these numbers come from? Okay, they have to do with intervals, and like I said, I'll show you in a later one. But you must memorize these so you can use them and so you can see an analysis and understand it. And so 6, 6/4. The 7th chords are easy to remember because it goes 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, and then there's a 4/2. And actually, sometimes on this last one, they just use 2. And if you put just 2, then it really is 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. But it's pretty close to that. You should be able to remember these numbers pretty easily. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 4, 2. And for the triads, 6, 6, 4. Now, what does this look like on the keyboard? All right, I'm going to just point out a couple things. Okay, so on the keyboard, here's a root position triad. Why do I keep using C major? I think I want to use the one that I wrote up there. So let's use this one, FAC. That's the one I wrote. Notice that there's a note in between. It looks exactly, of course it looks exactly like what we wrote in the music there. So you could kind of see the parallel between skipping a note and what you see on the keyboard. Now, let me invert it and watch what it looks like on the keyboard. So notice the keyboard has this like 2 notes between the upper. And if you notice first inversion here, there's a bigger space. There's a 4th between the upper notes and the bottom ones are together, just like you see on the keyboard. Right? So that's a little 3rd there, and there's a bigger 4th there. When you invert it one more time, so again, I'm going to take this bottom note and I'm going to move it up an octave. It's going to go, it's going to go there, but I want to use the highlighter like this, and I'll take away the one on the bottom. So I just flipped it over, and that corresponds to the second inversion that you see here. Sounds like this, and you can see there's 2 notes in the chord that are skipping over, we have a space here, skipping over this. It's a wider space there. Alright, why do I make such a big deal out of this? Well, sometimes you're reading chords, especially if you're a keyboard player, and you shouldn't waste your time trying to figure out every single note that's there. You can take a look at the picture of it. I'm going to write this in red off of the staff. And I'm going to use a red pen, not a red highlighter. It's going to look like this. Okay, like this. So if I said this to you, just in your brain right away, you know what that is. It's a root position triad. You know that's a second inversion. A second inversion, and this is a first inversion. And you can tell because of the shape of it, right? It may not be perfect here the way I wrote it, but because of where the gap is in the snowman, you might want to say, it corresponds. Compare those to the first and second inversion drawings and to what I just played. And you could see, depending on where the gap is, like, for example, this first one here, this corresponds, this big gap here is this gap here. So we know that's this big gap here, right? So we know that chord's a second inversion. We can see the 2 top notes that are together make it, that's the configuration of a second inversion. And the one after that, of course, this one, well, that gap there corresponds to this gap here. And if I were to move the top note, like if I move this one away and I go down to the inversion we had before, we're having an F chord here. Okay, now you can see that the gap is, this is a first inversion because this gap here is here. All right, so that might kind of help you to recognize these inversions by looking at the shape of the chord. Same thing for the seventh chords. Now you notice the seventh chords have a more variety of shape because there's an extra inversion. All right, but again, it's not too difficult to distinguish these, and I'm going to tell you how. You look for this second. When the chords pack together, if you have these two notes that don't stack up exactly, they have to be written like this, side by side, because they cannot stack up together. You look for that. If it's at the top, it's in first inversion. If it's in the middle, it's second, and if it's on the bottom, it's third. In addition, you're always going to be looking for the root of the chord, and I'll explain why. So when you find that second, you just look for the note that's on top, and that's going to be the root. So there's the root, there's the root, there's the root. When you see the second, when the chords compact like that, the note on top is the root of the chord. It's important to know the root of the chord because that identifies the chord where it is in the scale, and it really identifies the function of that chord in a chord progression, as you will learn. Okay, so again, memorize this chart here of the figured bass symbols. Okay, so these are figured bass. You just think of the figures as like numbered bass, right? They could have called it numbered bass system. Figured bass symbols, I guess you would say. All right, and memorize the configurations of each of these chords in their what they look like when they're compact. Now I'm going to add one final thing, so I hope this isn't too much, that your head's not exploding at this point. But if it is, luckily you can always rewind and go back and look at this again. Okay, so what I want to tell you is that, as I mentioned in the other video when I was explaining chords and parts of the chords, how they don't change if you move them to different positions, this is really important in terms of the inversions. And this is why I mentioned it before. Because notice, what the most important thing is not the configuration of the chord as you see it here, because I shouldn't say 90, but a lot of the time, these chords do not appear like this in music. For example, you may have a string quartet, and each of the instruments, the two violins, the viola, and the cello, they each have their own separate line in the music, and the chord looks nothing like this, okay? So it could be a vocal score, it could be for choir. The music is not going to look like this. So you're going to have to figure out the chord in some other way, which we will get to. But what's my point? Well, my point is that when you have these chords in different positions, what's important is the note that is at the bottom. You have to recognize that different parts of the chord are on the bottom. So let's take a look at this. When it's in, so I will write it over here on the left. So for a root position chord, okay, so this is the position. The bass, okay, now the bass is always the lowest note. It's not necessarily a bass instrument, but it's the lowest note that's sounding. So the bass has the root. That seems simple. In first inversion, you can kind of refer to the thing at the right. What's in the bass? The third of the chord. When it's in second inversion, what's in the bass? The fifth of the chord. And of course, if it's in third inversion, what's in the bass? The seventh of the chord. All right. So When you're taking a look at a chord and you recognize that it's in first, second, third inversion, now you know what part of the chord should be the lowest note, whether it's written like this as you see in the music up here or in some other manner. Okay, I hope this was clear. I know I did this very quickly, and I hope this helps. I'll see you in the next video when I talk about these figured bass symbols and what they mean. Thanks for listening.